In this video, you'll learn how to get started with Pinia using setup stores in around 30 minutes. So what we're going to do here is create this simple counter app where we can increase and decrease the counter. We can always see whether the counter is even or odd. We can edit our counter, and we have multiple pages, and the value of the counter is always the same regardless of what page we're on. And we're going to first create this app in the usual composition API way by adding reactive data, methods, and computed properties. And then we're going to move all of our data, methods, and computed properties into a Pinia Setup Store, into state, actions, and getters. And we'll also cover two-way binding, how to use our store everywhere, and child components. And I'll explain what Pinia is and why you would want to use it later. If you're new here, my name's Danny. I'm an indie app developer and creator of Fudgit, the popular cross-platform app, created with Vue 3 and Quasar 2, which you can download free for iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows from fudgit.com. And in case you find the app useful and you want to subscribe for extra features, I have a little discount code for you here. Just tap on discount code and enter the code MAKEAPPS. I also create courses on web development, Vue 3, Quasar, and much more, which you can find at makeappsacademy.com, including my new course, Vue 3, Create a Mobile and Desktop App with Quasar 2 and Pinia, where I explain Pinia in much more detail and with a much more complicated app. Let's jump over to the Vue 3 docs site. So I'm just going to Google Vue 3 and jump to the Vue website and install, and scroll down to creating a Vue application. And we do need to have Node.js installed before we can create a Vue app. And if you just click on that link there, you can install Node.js here. And once that's installed, we can now create a Vue project by running this command, npm create vue at latest. So I'm going to copy this and jump over to my terminal, which is running within VS Code. And I'll paste that command in and hit enter. So for the project name, I'm going to enter learn-pinia-setup. I'm going to choose no to TypeScript, no to JSX. We are going to be creating multiple pages, so I'm going to choose yes to Vue router. And of course, we are going to be using Pinia, so I'm going to choose yes to Pinia. I'll choose no to vtest, no to end-to-end testing solution. For simplicity, I'm going to choose no to ESLint, although you might want to consider using this in your own projects. And I'll choose no to the Vue DevTools 7 extension. And you can see it's created our project. We just need to cd into the folder it's created, run npm install to install dependencies, and then run npm run dev to launch the app. And I can see the folder it's created, Learn Pinia Setup. So I'm going to drag that into VS Code. Then I'll open up the terminal, run npm install. It's finished installing the dependencies. So now I'm going to run npm run dev. And the app is now running. And if we just command and click on this link, we can now see the boilerplate Vue app running in the browser. Okay, I'm going to start by simplifying this project as much as possible. So we currently have two pages, this home page and this about page. So I'm going to jump to the component for this home page, which is in source, views, and home view.vue. And I'm going to remove this script section and remove everything inside the template tags. And I'm just going to add a div with a class of home. And inside that, I'm going to add a h1 with the text home inside and save that. Then I'm going to copy all of this code and jump to the component for the about page, which is about view.vue. Paste that over and change the class here to about, and change the text in the heading to about as well, and save that. So now we just have two simple pages with the words home and about on them. But I also want to get rid of all this stuff at the top. So I'm going to jump to the root Vue component, which is app.vue here in the root of the source folder. And again, I'm going to remove this script section and remove this style section at the bottom. And all I want in this app to begin with is just this nav section with the links to our two pages and this root of Vue component, which is where our pages are displayed. So I'm going to select this nav component here, copy that, and then I'm going to select all of this header element and delete that and paste in this nav element and fix the indentation. And we definitely need to make sure we leave this router view component in so we can display our pages. And I'm going to save that. And we still have some styling, which is being added here. I also want to get rid of that. So I'm going to jump to the source folder and this main.js file. And these styles are coming from this main.css, which is being imported. So I'm just going to delete that and save that. Let's also delete all of the components in this components folder because we're not going to need any of them. So I'm going to select those and click on delete. And I'm going to jump back to app.vue. And I'm just going to add a little pipe between these navigation links. So after this home router link, I'm going to add a space, a pipe symbol, and another space, and save that. And I also want everything to be in the center. So I'm going to add a div at the top of our template with a class of app. And I'm going to move everything inside that div, save that. And then I'm going to add a style tag and target this app class.app and just set text align to center to place everything in the center. And we now have a nice simple app, which we can use to begin learning about Pinia Setup Stores. Let's start by adding some basic elements and styles for our counter on this home page. So I'm going to jump to source, views, and home view.view. And I'm going to get rid of this h1 and replace it with a div with a class of count. And for now, I'll just put 0 in there and save that. Let's add some buttons under that for changing the counter. So I'll add a div with a class of buttons. And inside that, I'm going to add a button with a minus symbol in it. And I'll duplicate that button and put a plus symbol in this button, save that. Let's add some styles to make everything a bit bigger. So I'll add a style tag, target this div with a class of count, and I'll set the font size to 60 pixels and set the margin to 20 pixels, save that. Let's target these button elements. So I'll target the div with a class of buttons and the button element inside that. Set the font size to 40 pixels. And let's add a margin of 10 pixels, save that. Let's set up some data and methods so that we can actually modify this counter. So in between the template and style tags, let's add a script setup section. We'll set up a ref for our count. So I'm going to create a const called count, set that equal to the ref method, and give that an initial value of 0. And we need to import this ref method from Vue. So let's add import ref from Vue. Let's attach this count ref to our template. So I'm going to select this 0 inside this count div and replace that with double curly braces and count and save that. And if we change the initial value of this ref to 10 and save that, then we can see the count update on the template. Let's set that back to 0 and save that. Let's create some methods for increasing and decreasing the counter. So I'm going to add a function here called increase count. And all we want to do is increase this count ref by 1. So to get to the underlying value in this ref, we can just do count.value. And to increase it by 1, we can just do ++. So let's add a click handler to this plus button and set that equal to this method increase count and save that. And we can see that's now working. So let's duplicate this function, rename it to decrease count. And to decrease the count by 1, we can just do -- instead of ++. And so let's add a click handler to the minus button and fire this decrease count method and save that. And we can now see both of our buttons are working to increase or decrease this counter. let's use a computed property to display whether our counter is currently odd or even. So let's add the markup for this first. So underneath this div with a class of buttons, I'll first add a HR element to create a line, and then under that, I'll add another div, and I'll just put the text, the counter is colon, and for now, I'll just put odd/even, although later on we'll actually spit out either odd or even, depending on the value of the count. Let's create our computed property to do this. So we need to import the computed method from Vue. So let's add that to our import. And underneath our functions, let's add a constant called odd or even, set that equal to a computed property, add the arrow function, and we can use the remainder operator to figure out whether this count is currently odd or even. So what we can do is if count.value remainder operator 2 is equal to 0. In other words, if we divide the value of our count by 2 and get the remainder, and that remainder is equal to 0, then we know the value of the count is currently even. So if that's the case, we can just return the text even. Otherwise, we can return the text odd. So let's jump back up to our template and replace this text odd/even with this computed property. So I'll delete that, add double curly braces, and the name of our computed property, odd or even, and save that. So the counter is 0 and it says this counter is even. If we increase it to 1, then it says the counter is odd, and so on. So what we want to do now is move all of our data, methods, and our computed property into a Pinia Setup Store, into state, actions, and getters. But first of all, what is Pinia? Well, it's a state management library similar to Vuex, but optimized for Vue 3 and the composition API, and with many improvements over Vuex. And basically, Pinia allows us to store all of our app's core data, all of the methods related to modifying that data and getting that data in one single centralized place in a Pinia store. And all of the components in our app have access to the data and methods and computed properties, or the state, actions, and getters, which are in that Pinia store. So why do we need all of our app's data and methods in one centralized place? Well, right now, all of our app's core data, methods, and this computed property are all stored in this one component, home_view.vue. But let's say we wanted to use our counter on a different page, such as our about page. Well, right now this would be difficult because this about view.vue component is a sibling of the home_view.vue component. And there's no easy way of accessing the data or methods which are in a sibling component. So what we would need to do is take our count ref, the methods, and the computed property, and move them into the app's root component, app.vue. Then we would need to pass the count ref down to the home view and about view components using props, initialize the prop on each of those components. And then in order for these child components, home view and about view.vue, to trigger the methods in their parent component, app.vue, we would need to trigger custom events on these child components. And then in app.vue, we would need to listen out for these events before we can finally trigger our methods and update the counter. Well, this gets very complicated and messy very quickly, especially as your app gets more complicated and your app's component tree gets more deeply nested. But with Pinia and state management, we don't need to worry about passing data down with props, triggering custom events and listening out for these custom events, because all of the components in our app have access to the state or data in our Pinia store. All of the components of our app can trigger the actions or methods in our store, and all of the components in our app have access to the getters or computed properties in our store as well. So it makes it much easier for us to manage our app's core data, and it also makes it much simpler for us to break our app up into child components, which we'll demonstrate later on. And the Vue build tool already added Pinia to our project and created an example Pinia store. And that's in this stores folder and this counter.js. So this example Pinia store is a Pinia Setup style store. And if I jump to this page on the Pinia site, we can see an example here of the original type of Pinia store, which was option stores. With option stores, we had three clearly defined sections: state for storing all of the data, actions where all of our methods go for modifying the data in the state, and getters for getting data from the state, modifying it in some way and returning that value. And if you want to see this same tutorial but with option stores, then check out my original Pinia video, Learn Pinia in 30 minutes. And if you want to learn more about the differences between option stores and setup stores, check out my video, Pinia Option Store versus Setup Stores, and I'll put links to those videos in the description. However, with setup stores, this is done a little bit differently. We don't have these clearly defined sections, and instead, any refs or reactive objects will make up the state or the data of our store. Any functions, such as this increment function, will make up our actions, i.e. methods which will allow us to modify the state or data in our store. And any computed properties in our store will make up the getters in our store. And getters allow us to access a data property in our store, modify it in some way, and return the value. And this value will always be updated in real time whenever our dependencies change, i.e. when a reactive data property, which they are using, changes. And this store, which has been auto-generated, is also for a counter, and that's nothing to do with what we've been doing. This is just the default store that's generated when we create a Vue project with Pinia. But for now, so that we can build up this Pinia store bit by bit, I'm going to select everything inside this define store method and delete it. And I'll also remove this import, which is no longer being used. Let's start from scratch by setting up the state for this Pinia Setup Store. So the state in our store is just for storing reactive data properties, refs or reactive objects. And if we jump back to home-view.vue, we have this count ref, which is storing the value of our counter. So let's move this into a state property in our Pinia store. And when we're using Pinia Setup Stores, we can literally just copy and paste this. So I'm going to copy this const count and jump to counter.js and paste that inside this define store method. However, with Pinia Setup Stores, we also need to remember to return anything which we want to make available to our components. So we need to add a return statement at the bottom and add this count constant. And because we're using the ref method from Vue, we also need to import that. So let's import ref from Vue and save that. And now let's use this count property, which is in our store, on this home-view.vue component to display our counter instead of this count ref, which is hard-coded into home-view.vue. So first of all, we need to import our store. What we want to import is this constant here, use counter store. So let's jump back to home-view.vue. And after this first import line, we want to import use counter store from @/stores/counter. And this @ symbol is just an alias to this source folder. And you can see that set up in this vite.config.js file. And you can see that there. Now back to home-view.vue. In order to use this store, we need to assign it to a constant. So let's add another constant here. And I'll call this store counter. Set that equal to this use counter store method, use counter store and parentheses, and I'll save that. And we can now access everything that's in our store using this store counter constant. And now that we've assigned our store to a constant, we should see it in the Vue Dev Tools. So I'm going to open up the Dev Tools, click on these arrows and View, and I might just need to reload the page. And we can now see this little Pinia logo here. And if we click on that, we can see all of our stores. We can see our counter store, and it's getting this name counter from this first parameter in this define store method. And we can see our state in that store here, and we can see our count state property. So now let's use this count property from our Pinia store on our home page. So let's jump back to home view.view and jump up to where we're displaying our count. And to access the count that's in our store, we can just do store counter.count. And with Vuex, we had to do store counter.state.count. But with Pinia, we don't need to do this. All of these state properties, actions, and getters are immediately available to us. So all we need to do is store counter.count. So let's save that and reload. And to make sure this is working, let's jump back to our store counter.js and change the value of this count ref. Save that, reload, and we can now see it's changed to 10. So let's set this back to 0 and save that. And we can also change the value of this state property in our DevTools here. So if I click on these plus and minus buttons, you can see the counter being updated in the template in real time. Actions allow us to access the data properties in our state, in our store, and modify them. So let's create actions for increasing and decreasing the counter. So let's jump back to home view.view and down to our two functions here. And again, with a setup store, we can just copy and paste these. So let's select these two functions and copy them and jump to counter.js and paste them underneath this constant. And we don't need to make any changes to these functions because we have the same name for our count ref in this store. And again, to make these methods or actions available to the components in our store, we need to return them. So let's add these to our return statement. So increase count and decrease count. And just to make it really clear what's state and what is actions, I'm going to add some comments here to break this up. So I'll add a comment which says state and place this count ref under that. And I'll add another block comment which says actions, and we'll place our actions underneath this comment. And then in our return statement, I'll add a comment which says state above this count state property, and another comment which says actions above our two actions. So now let's save that and jump back to home view.view. And if we jump to our two buttons here, let's trigger these actions which are in our store instead of these methods which we have defined in this home view.view component. And again, we can use this store counter constant to access these actions. So all we need to do is store counter dot increase count to access this action here. So let's jump back to home view.view and up to our buttons and replace decrease count and increase count with store counter dot and then the name of the actions. So let's save that and see if this is working now. Click on the plus button and we can see the count increased. And we can see it's also being increased in the DevTools here as well. And both of these buttons are now working. Getters allow us to access a data property in our state in our store, modify it in some way, and return a value which all of our components can use. Just like we're doing with this computed property in home view.view, where we're displaying the text even or odd based on the value of the count. So let's move this odd or even computed property into our store, where it will then be a getter. So I'm going to select this computed property, copy that, jump to counter.js, and underneath our two actions here, I'll add another block comment which says getters. Let's paste this computed property underneath, and let's also add a comment for the return statement as well to make this a little bit tidier. And again, to make this getter available to all of our components, we need to return it. So let's jump down to the return statement, add a comma, and let's add another comment which says getters. And let's return this odd or even getter and save that. And now we can use this getter on any of our components. So let's jump back to home.view and scroll up to this text here and use the getter that's in our store instead of this computed property, which is on home view.view. And again, I think you know what we need to do here. We just need to add store counter dot and then the name of our getter, odd or even. So let's save that and see if this is working. Reload the page. We have an error here. So let's see what's going on. Computed is not defined. Okay, so we just need to jump back to counter.js and import the computed method from Vue. So let's jump to the top and add that to our imports from Vue here. Computed, save that, reload. Let's change our counter. And we can see this is working again. It's telling us whether the number is even or odd, except it's now using the getter, which is in our store. And we can also see the current value of that getter in our dev tools here as well. So let's jump back to home view.view. And we're now no longer using this count ref in this component, or these methods, or this computed property. So let's select all of these and delete them. And we're now no longer using ref or computed in this component. So let's delete this import line as well and save that. Let's reload and make sure everything is still working. And everything is still working. So two-way data binding is super simple with Pinia. So let's say we want to be able to edit our count using an input element. All we need to do is bind that input to the state property that's in our store using vModel. So let's demonstrate this. Let's jump to home view.view and up to the template. And under this div with the odd or even text, I'm going to add another HR. And then I'll add a H3, which says edit counter, colon. Let's add an input element. And let's make this a type of number because this is for a number. So now all we need to do to bind this input to this count data property in our state, in our store, is just add a vModel to this input and set that to store counter.count. So let's add a vModel to this input and set that to store counter.count and save that. And we can see that input on the page and it's already set to the current value of the count. And if we change this either by selecting the text and typing in a number, we can see the count at the top of our page updated immediately. Or if we use these step buttons on the input, we can see the counter changed as well. To demonstrate how easy Pinia and state management makes it for us to use our app's core data everywhere, let's add a simple counter to our About page. So let's jump to Source, Views, and About view.view. And again, to use our store on this page, we do need to import the store and assign it to a constant. So let's jump back to home view.view and copy this script setup section where we're doing just that, importing the store and assigning it to a constant. So I'll copy that and paste that to the bottom of about view.view and save that. Let's add a button underneath this about heading. So let's add a button element and we'll set the text inside this button to store counter.count and save that. And we can see that button appear on the page with the current value of the counter. Let's also increase the count when this button is clicked. So I'll just break this up into different lines. Let's add a click handler to this button. And again, to trigger this increase count action in our store, we just need to do store counter dot and the name of the action, increase count, and save that. Now, if we click on this button, we can see the counter increasing and it's now on 54. And if we jump back to our home page, we can see the counter is 54 everywhere in our app. So now that all of our app's core data and methods are in our Pinia store, it's going to be really easy for us to break our app up into child components without having to pass data around all over the place using props or using provide inject, and without having to emit events from child components to parent components and listening out for those events. So let's put this counter into its own component. So I'm going to jump to the Explorer, and in the components folder, I'm going to create a new file called counter.vue, and I'll add the template tags and save that. Let's jump back to home view.vue and scroll up. Let's cut this div with a class of count with our counter in it and save that. And we see that counter disappear. Let's jump to counter.vue and paste that in here. We see red squiggly lines because, again, we need to import our store and assign it to this store counter constant. So let's jump to home view.vue and again copy the script setup section, jump back to counter.vue and paste that in here and save that. So now we just need to jump to home view.vue and import this component. So after this line where we're importing the store, we can just do import counter from, and this is in the source folder, components and counter.vue. So we can just import this from @/components/counter.vue and save that. And we can now use this child component on our page. So let's place it above this div with a class of buttons. And for the tag name, we just want to use the same name that we're importing it as. So let's add a tag with the name counter. I'll place that there and save that. And we can now see the counter back on the page again. And we can see everything is still working straight away without any messing around with props, provide inject, or custom events. If you want to learn more about Pinia Setup Stores, including how to use multiple Pinia Setup Stores in one project, how to use more advanced state properties, such as arrays of complex data and reactive objects, how to use watchers in your stores, and how to use Pinia Setup Stores to manage a much more complicated app with full create, read, update, and delete capabilities, then go to makeappsacademy.com and check out my course Vue 3 Create a Mobile and Desktop App with Quasar 2 and Pinia. In this course, you'll get to use Vue 3, Quasar and Pinia Setup Stores to create this money management app called Moneyballs, in which you can add an income or an expense entry. You can see the balance of all of your entries. You can mark an entry as paid and see the balance of all of your paid entries. You can sort your entries. We can also swipe left on an entry to delete it. And it also has a settings page where we can change a bunch of settings, such as showing a running balance and changing the currency symbol. And it even has a dark mode with a completely different color scheme. And you'll also get this app running and working on 5 different platforms: web browser, iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows. Go to makeappsacademy.com and you can watch the first 6 modules of this course free. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.